My name is Brianna White. I'm in the political science department here at Northwestern. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit about how incarceration can actually impact someone's politics. So this first image is of a group of prisoners during the Attica prison riots of 1971. Attica Correctional Facility is located in New York. And in 1971, it was notorious for the negative relationship between prisoners and guards, for the overcrowding, and for the limited services that were offered to prisoners. Now, eventually, this all came to a head. This tension came to a head in 71 when a group of prisoners actually stormed the facilities. They initiated a riot, and they took hostage several guards and prisoners. So a tense negotiation process began between the governor and these prisoners. And eventually, Governor Rockefeller at the time actually gave in to a bunch of the demands of the prisoners. And these were political demands they were making at the time. However, shortly after that process ended, a bunch of state troopers actually stormed the facility, and they ended up killing guards and prisoners. So while there's a negative ending to that story, it's really interesting because there's a group of prisoners who have limited resources, limited education, coming together and making political demands of the system. Now, this isn't just a historical story. There's also contemporary examples of prisoners who have limited resources and limited education coming together and making demands. Now, in 2013, thousands of prisoners across facilities in California actually initiated a hunger strike. Now, what's really interesting about this as well is that a hunger strike is a common tool that people use in social movements to make demands of government and to make demands of authority figures. Now, the thing that they were really passionate about is the solitary confinement that happens across prisons. They claimed it was human rights abuse, and they wanted it to stop. What's interesting also is that eventually they were somewhat successful. Solitary confinement has actually declined throughout California prisons. Something as an important background moment is that throughout the US, in 48 states, when you receive a felony conviction, you actually lose the right to vote. So these individuals are making claims and demands despite being disenfranchised. And so it's a question of what happens when you lose what I deem a fundamental right of citizenship, the right to vote. We don't actually know much about these individuals while they're incarcerated, but we do have some data about what happens when they return home. So a person with a felony conviction returning home is actually less politically involved. They don't care about politics, they have low opinions of the government, and even if they do have the right to vote, they decide not to participate in that system. Now, it isn't just an individual process. It's something that affects other community members as well. When you have a high concentration of felons in an area, in a neighborhood, political participation of other community members actually decreases over time. Other community members are less likely to vote, they're less likely to participate in campaigns, and they're less likely to give donations. So it's a process that affects so many different people. So we have to understand how is this happening to these individuals and what can we do about it. So that's my research question. That's what I'm interested in investigating. How does prison time, how does incarceration fundamentally impact your politics? How does it impact your political engagement? And so what I'm trying to do here is actually make two different research contributions. So the first is I'm actually tracing back that behavior to incarceration. So I mentioned that there's research done about people once they return home, but we don't really know what's happening in these institutions. And the second contribution is actually a methodological question. It's a conceptual question. How do we actually measure politics and measure political engagement? Traditionally, in political science, we measure through voting, through giving donations. However, I think because these individuals have limited resources and limited education, they perceive politics in a completely different way. So understanding that is really crucial to understanding how they become involved while they're incarcerated and when they leave. And to do this, I'm actually using case studies. I'm curious about how context, how certain variables can influence political engagement. So I'm actually going to be starting in our great state of Illinois, and then I'll be moving to California and Maine. Those will be my 3 case studies. And these 3 states vary in really interesting ways. So one way is the history of prison riots that are happening in these states. So a state like California is kind of notorious for prison riots occurring throughout its history. A state like Maine has never had a major prison riot, and Illinois has only had one. The second component is the racial composition of these prisons. So Illinois, once again, fairly representative. It has a majority Black and Latino in the prisons. A state like Maine is pretty much white. And then a state like California also has immigrant groups represented, as well as the 4 major racial groups: African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and whites. Now, the third component is the population of the prisons. California, once again, notorious for being over capacity. Maine is usually undercrowded, and Illinois is usually at capacity. Now, the final variable that's really interesting and kind of ties back to my earlier point is the electoral rights that these individuals have. So in Maine, one of the 2 states where individuals can vote while they're incarcerated, and there's never been a comprehensive study about how that actually impacts them. In California, you receive your rights back once you've been removed off of probation, and in Illinois, you automatically receive your rights back once you've been released. To actually learn about this process within these states, I'm going to be using 4 different methodological kind of components. The first is surveys. I think we all enjoy surveys. I do. They provide that aggregate level data. I'm going to be sending out surveys to about 1,000 prisoners across the US, but particularly within these 3 states. The second component will be will be interviews. So I'll actually be going into prisons and having conversations with individuals about their experience while they're incarcerated and their hopes and dreams for the future. The third component will be focus groups. Focus groups are helpful because I'm bringing in about 10 to 15 inmates at a time, and I'm going to ask them questions like, what is politics? What is community? How do you improve the political system? So I'm really getting at that second contribution I want to make, which is how do they actually perceive politics and how do they want to move forward with political engagement? And then the final component is prisoner letters. So I actually have access to about 1,200 prisoner letters that they've written across the US. It's about their prison time, about issues like healthcare, issues like education. They're really talking about things that are concerning them. And so I'll be analyzing those letters to find a general trend that happens across states. So this process will actually begin in a few months. I'll be sending out the first of the surveys. I'll be sending them to their mailboxes and hoping to get them responses from individuals. And so hopefully in about a year or so, I actually can come back here and tell you an update of what actually happened. So thank you for listening.